fall asleep on you. If you fall asleep on me, that's understandable. Anyway, we're going to start our letter number 2 of the Rambam. The Rambam, just to tell you, has many, many letters, some of which are very personal, and I want to go over them too eventually, because the personal letters are quite interesting. But there are 3 major public letters that the Rambam wrote to be disseminated in a community. We have looked at the first letter, and the first letter, you'll recall, is Mamar, has 2 names, Mamar Kiddush Hashem or Igeres Hashmad. Mamar Kiddush Hashem just means an essay about the sanctification of God's name, and the other title is A Letter Regarding Forced Conversion. Those titles were not given by the Rambam himself. Those were titles that the translators of the letters, because letters were written in Hebrew letters, but Arabic language. The letters were eventually translated into Hebrew, and the translators, different translators gave different titles to the letter. And that dealt, Igeres Hashmad, or Mamar Kiddush Hashem, which we looked at for a few weeks, dealt with martyrdom and the duty to give up your life for the sanctification of God's name. And the Rambam ultimately took a lenient position regarding the particulars of that conversion. We went over that last week, but you will recall the 2 pieces of advice that the Rambam gives. The first piece of advice is that even if you're not able to keep all of the Torah, you must keep whatever you keep and never have the attitude that you're so far gone that your mitzvot don't count. And the second piece of advice that he gave was, get out of there as soon as you can. And a Jew is obligated to escape hostile spiritual conditions, even if it means it will be a danger to relocate, and certainly if it means you'll lose all of your wealth. Again, if you think about Germany, a lot of Jews didn't want to leave Germany, where they were somewhat prosperous, at least initially, because they were afraid they would lose all of their wealth. And we know, again, I can't blame them because, once again, nobody expected. In fact, just as a little aside, I saw the most amazing letter. One of the great Gedolim of the last generation, who was a very interesting Gadol, there's a very fascinating English biography about him, was Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg, who was a very close Talmud of the Alter of Slobodka. He was raised in the Eastern European Torah-only tradition, and then he went to Germany to get a degree in philosophy. He either had a doctorate or we're not exactly sure if he actually got the doctorate, but it certainly was all virtually a doctorate. And he became eventually the rector, the dean of the Hildesheimer Seminary in Berlin that tried to integrate Limud HaTorah with academic understandings, which was very, very controversial in the Eastern European milieu from which he came. And then he was in the Warsaw Ghetto during the Holocaust, and he did quite a lot to help people. Baruch Hashem, he survived the Warsaw Ghetto, and then he moved to Switzerland, where for the last 20 years of his life, he lived a very, very quiet life. Even though he was a world-famous Gaon, he never became a Rosh Hashiva, he never took on any position. And he used to say upon himself, it was kind of a tragic life. He got divorced as a very young man. He never remarried. There were many, many tragic elements in his life, but also he was tragic because he had kind of a multiple identity that was not fully accepted. He said people offered him jobs in Eretz Yisrael, they offered him jobs in America. He just stayed in Switzerland where he didn't really have too much to do. He wrote, and he said that the Haredi world does not accept me because of my academic credentials. And the academic world does not accept me because of my religious credentials. He felt he did not belong to any world, and because of that, he remained in somewhat isolation. Again, there's a lot of tragic elements to Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg. His famous book of responsa is called the Seridei Eish. In fact, there's an interesting story even about his funeral. And that is, he was going to be buried. He died around I think maybe the very early, maybe 1960 or the very early 1960s. And he was going to be buried in the Sanhedria, Beit Chaim, I think next to Meir Bar Ilan, prominent Zionist, etc. And in the middle of the funeral, his old chaverim from Slobodka, the Rosh Yeshivas of Hebron, came, and they actually, it's hard to imagine this, they actually kidnapped the body. They took the body, and they said, we're burying him on Har HaZeisim next to the altar of Slobodka, because that's his true home. His true spiritual home is with the altar of Slobodka. And I thought this may have been above a Maisa, but I heard from Rav Mendel Weinbach, Zechron Levracha, the Rosh of Smech, that he was at the Lubaya, and he actually saw this happen. So in many ways, Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg's was kind of a conflicted, complicated person who was trying to live in both worlds and never felt fully accepted in those worlds. And then he died, and then like many people, there's kind of a little bit of a rehabilitation. Now he's more accepted, just like the Ramchal. The Ramchal himself was very, very controversial in his lifetime, but after he died, he became a little bit more accepted. I'm sorry, I've lost track. Why did I brought up Sri Desh because of something here? Okay. Anyone remembers why was that? Oh, yeah. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, so I wanted to mention that he was director of the Hildesheimer Seminary in Berlin. And in 1933, which is when Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and that's when they began. There was no Holocaust then. But, Hitler had written what he wrote in Mein Kampf, so Hitler's overall agenda was known. And there began to be the Nuremberg laws, various anti-Semitic laws. So he wrote a letter to the Chancellor, Adolf Hitler, signed by a lot of rabbis, saying, we know, of course, that you had to be kind of radical in your campaign speeches just to get votes of the anti-Semites, but we also are very, very confident that this is not your true feelings, and we can meet together and work out a way in which Jews can live in Germany. After all, we have been in Germany for 1,000 years. We've contributed so much to the society. And he requested a meeting between Hitler and various rabbis so we could work things out in anti-Semitism. Mark Shapiro, who wrote the biography of Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg, kind of notes laconically, this letter was never responded to. There was never a response to this particular letter. The point that I'm making is that I'm not going to blame people who stayed in Germany because they thought things would get better. Even the Sridei Eish, who was a Gadol B'Torah Mamish, believed that things would be better. But still, the Rambam makes the point that when you live in an environment where you cannot keep the Torah, you have to get out. Right? So those were the points in the Maimer Kiddush Hashem. Once again, number one, halachically, you didn't have to give your life in order to avoid professing faith. Number two, you're still Jewish. Whatever mitzvahs you do count. Number three, get out of there if you can, even if it involves danger, and certainly if it involves losing your money, because frankly, there are things that are more important than money and possessions, and that is the ability of keeping the Torah. Now, the Rambam wrote this letter, you'll recall, at the age of 27, and his famous works, including the commentary to the Mishnah, had not yet been published, and yet somehow he was known. Again, it's hard for me to imagine in a time before there was internet, before there was telephone, before there was email, how a person, gets a reputation beyond his immediate city, especially if he doesn't even have works that were circulated in manuscript. And yet, even at the age of 27, the Rambam was quite famous. Now, unfortunately, Islamic persecutions resurfaced in many, many countries over and over and over again. Different rulers, different kings, different circumstances, and sometimes different severities. The particular shmad that the Rambam dealt with in Igeret HaShmad was the mildest of the mildest, which gave the Rambam a lot of leeway. That's simply, you get stopped by some juvenile delinquent who puts a knife to your throat and says, say these words or I'll kill you. And you just had to say the words. Then you went home and put on tefillin and made Shabbos and everything else. So it was shmad, but it was a very mild shmad. However, in other Islamic countries, it was quite worse. You had to worship, you had to go to mosques, you had to go to different prayers, etc. And they monitored you about keeping mitzvot. And this is what the Rambam dealt with around 10 years later in a letter that he received from the Yemenite community in Taiman. Now remember, if you can imagine a map, Mitzrayim and Taiman are not next door. There is a considerable distance between them. And the Rambam was approached by the elders of Taiman to help them through a very, very difficult Islamic shmad. And here the Rambam wrote a letter, and this letter is known as either Igeret Taiman, or once again, the translators who translated the letter from Arabic gave the letter another name, and that's called Petach Tikva. The opening, just like the city, Petach Tikva, the opening of hope, the beginning of hope. And although Igeret Hashmad, although Igeret Taiman and Igeret Hashmad, which are separated by about 12 years. So by the time the Rambam writes Igeret Taiman, he is a very, very famous figure. He is very, very, very well known, very honored, considered to be one of the leading rabbis in the world at the time. But although he's dealing with very much of the same themes, he really addresses it from a very different vantage point. He does not discuss the duties of martyrdom. He does not discuss giving your life. This is largely a letter of encouragement, of chizuk, of not losing faith, of understanding that God loves the Jewish people, and understanding that, in a sense, being persecuted and standing up to persecution is a badge of honor and distinction. And it shows how special and esteemed you are in God's eyes. And only the righteous will be able to stand up to these things. And this is when a person is tested. And it's very much is a mamar of, although there are many, many things in it, but it's a mamar of nechama, of comfort, of chizuk, of assuring people that God will never abandon you. And although there will be difficult times, you hold on tight. Now, obviously, individual people are going to suffer, but in terms of OUisrael Chai. And Igeret Taiman is a letter that you could certainly read today, and not just for its academic content, but to simply give oneself chizuk as we go through dark times and difficult times. And the Rambam says that Hashem will never abandon the Jewish people. And he quotes many, many verses to that effect. And he says this is part of the birth pains of Mashiach. This is part of the great, great struggles that we go through. Just as human birth requires a great deal of pain, so too the spiritual birth requires, called Chavlei Mashiach. And this is part of the Chavlei Mashiach. Now, there are many other things in the letter which I'll get to in a moment, but primarily the Rambam sees himself not so much to paskin halacha, but he sees himself as someone whose job is to comfort, to give strength, to tell people to be courageous, and to consider themselves especially righteous and beloved by God because of their willingness to hold on. And the Rambam does not shirk from a little bit of flattery. He talks about how ancient the Yemenite community was, how righteous it was, how charitable it was. And he says, look at your background, look at your history, look at where you've come from, and hold on to the traditions that you've gotten from your forefathers, and eventually all of this will pass. This will pass. The nature of, and again, he points out, the litany of all of the bad guys, whether it's Paro, Sisera, Nebuchadnezzar, Haman, all of the great nations that have tried to destroy the Jewish people have simply disappeared. Actually, it's very reminiscent, it's very, very similar. There's a famous letter, you can Google this, that Mark Twain wrote, of all people. Mark Twain was not Jewish. Samuel Clemens, his pen name was Mark Twain. I think I mentioned before that I have a little bit of a kesher to Mark Twain because although he was born in Missouri, he spent his later adult years in Hartford, Connecticut, where I grew up. And in Hartford, there is something called the Mark Twain House, which is his house, and it's become a museum. So this was the site of innumerable class trips when I was growing up. So I've spent many, many hours in the Mark Twain house. And at some point, Mark Twain was accused of being anti-Semitic. So he wrote a long letter, which was published in Harper's Magazine. It's interesting, Harper's Magazine is still around, but it was a magazine that, 150 years old. It was around in the 19th century. And the long letter was some of it was like, some of my best friends are Jewish type of thing, who knows whether he was anti-Semitic or not. But be it as it may, he writes about the miraculous nature of the Jew, that every world power tried to destroy us. And those world powers are long gone. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, the ancient Greeks, the Roman empires, they are all gone. But the one that survives is the Jew, who manages to survive, manages to flourish, manages to contribute. Well, the truth is, this is Mark Twain, and of course he was a wonderful English writer. But the truth is, this is exactly what the Rambam says. I don't know if Mark Twain had access to a translation of Igeret Teiman, but this is what the Rambam is saying. And again, it's a wonderful thing because you see the care and concern and compassion and the feeling that he has for people who are suffering and how he tries to build them up and how he tries to say, it's not going to last. You'll get over this. Things will get better. Hashem will not forget you. Because you have to understand that the consequence of these persecutions was both external and internal. Let me explain what I mean. Externally, people were giving in because they were threatened with death if they don't. That's one aspect of it. But internally, there were people that were saying, if God is letting this happen to us, he doesn't care anymore. He's forgotten about us. What's the point of staying with this if God himself doesn't care? That's an internal problem. In other words, it's not just externally we were being persecuted. People were giving up hope in two different ways. One was, if this is happening to us, God doesn't care. And then in another direction, they were saying, if Islam is so powerful, and of course people could say the same thing about Christianity in Europe, then maybe it's true. Maybe God did. Right? What is the claim of both Islam and Christianity? They don't deny the Sinaitic revelation. They say God gave the Torah to the Jews at Mount Sinai. They don't deny it. They accept that part of the Bible. But they say that God abrogated his covenant with the Jews, and he made new choices, a new revelation, either through Jesus or through Muhammad. And what do people think? If people see that in Europe, let's say, Christian Europe, Christianity is growing and growing and growing and growing and growing, and they see in the Islamic countries, Islam is growing and growing and growing and growing. So the internal problem that they have is not simply giving in to persecution. The internal problem they have is, maybe Islam is right. Maybe God did reject the Jewish people. Maybe God did supersede the covenant. Maybe they're right. How could you explain the growth, not just in numbers of adherents, but in political power? So the Rambam has to address the idea that the Torah, these are things that he said later in his 13 principles of faith. The Torah does not change. The Torah is immutable. Remember Maimed Har Sinai. Remember standing at Har Sinai and saying Nasa v'nishma. Right, we just celebrated it yesterday. Remember all of these things. Remember your past. Remember God's promises. And remember, and he quotes so many verses in Yeshayahu, the 7 haftarahs of comfort. And specifically, he quotes this verse, or these verses. Vatomer Tzion hazavani Hashem. Zion, the Jewish people, says, God has abandoned me. V'Hashem shechechani. And Hashem has forgotten me. And the answer is, Hatishkach isha ula. Can a mother forget her child? Merachem ben bitna. Can she stop having compassion for that which came out of her body? Doesn't happen. And then it goes on, Gam eila tishkachna. And even if it would happen that a mother would forget her child, Anochi lo eshkachech. I will not forget you. And the Rambam brings these verses. He wants them to hear. And in fact, in some ways, there's almost a redundancy. The Rambam likes to write in very short, very abbreviated. In fact, the Rambam often talks about the fact that he's not interested in increasing the size of a bookshelf. He just wants to say what he needs to say. But in Igeretz Teman, I have to say, it is a bit verbose. But it's verbose for a reason. Everything the Rambam did, he did for a reason. And that is, it is the nature of comfort that you need to repeat it over and over and over again. We see this in Nach itself. If you look at the 7 haftarahs of comfort, called the Shiva de Nechemta, that we read after Tisha B'Av. So, you ask somebody, what is the first haftarah about? Just summarize it in a sentence. He says, God loves us and he wants to redeem us. Okay? Then you ask next week, what's next week's haftarah about? God loves us and he wants to redeem us. Okay? Then the third week. In other words, it goes on and on and on and on and on and on and on. And the reader might be impatient. Like, why is God saying the same thing over and over and over and over and over again? So the Malbim heroically tries to show that, right, the Malbim has a famous shita, that there is no such thing as biblical synonyms. That even if God seems to be saying the same thing over and over and over again, each word is different. And the Malbim tries to show in his commentary, this word is this word is that. But I tell you, I actually have a different approach that's rooted in the Radak, and that is, there's nothing wrong with repetition when people have a broken heart. In other words, you can't approach comfort like you're an analytical brisker going through a Gemara. It says, well, why did Hashem have to say, I love you again? He already said, I love you in the last pasuk. Why is there a need to repeat? I don't think that's the right approach here. You got to repeat because people need to be built up. You can't ask a question, why did, let's say a child, well, I'm going to tell you a little story. They say that everybody remembers as a traumatic event in life the first time they were separated from their parents, the first time they got lost. And I remember that. I was with my mother-in-law, Shalom, in a big department store, and I wandered off to look at the toy department. Yes, because the toys were there, big toy department. And my mother was walking just a few feet away. And I looked, and for a second, I lost her. I was like 5. I lost her. I didn't know. And in just 5 or 10 seconds, oh, yeah, I'm abandoned. I'm going to be an orphan. Who's going to take me in? Where am I going to go? I was neurotic even then. Whatever. And of course, we were reunited after a few seconds. And she was hugging me. I love you. I was crying. She said, I love you. I love you. I love you. So what am I going to say? Why did you have to say I love you a third time? You already said it twice. That's not how it works. You got to have common sense here. Someone needs to be comforted again and again and again and again. The Jewish people were so devastated from Galus. The Navi has to comfort us again and again. And this is exactly what the Rambam is doing. I'll concede to you that in the Igeret Teman, there is a considerable amount of verbosity in repeating the message over and over and over again. But that's because people have to hear it over and over and over again. Something may enter your head, but it takes a while till it enters your heart, till you're able to act upon it, till it actually comforts you. And once again, I think it's part of the psychological genius of the Rambam, that he understands what it means to be demoralized. It's not just the threat of death that is hanging over them. It is the threat that their whole lives are no longer worth anything, that God doesn't care. And maybe the Christians are right, or in this case, the Muslims are right. And the Rambam needs to reassure them over and over again of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's love. Now, there's a lot of other stuff in the letter I'll get to, but I just want to point out that the Rambam says at the end of the letter that he wants this letter to be read publicly in shuls and in places of gathering. And he says he wrote it in Arabic, so even people who didn't know Lashon HaKodesh, he mentions women and children. That's another issue. The Rambam sometimes uses women and children as an expression for the ignorant. Okay, that's a separate issue I don't want to talk about now, but he makes the point. He wants people to hear it. And he says he knows he may get in trouble because there's a lot of defamatory references to Islam in the letter, and it may get back to Egypt, and he may get in trouble, but he says it is worthwhile. And you should know that this letter made such a powerful impression on the Jews of Yemen that they actually incorporated the Rambam's name in their Kaddish. What do we say in Kaddish? Kaddish is in Aramaic. So we say, may God's name, Yiskadal v'Yiskadash, may God's name be magnified and sanctified, b'chayechon, speaking to the congregation, in your life, uviyomechon, in your days, and in the lifetime of all of Israel, may God's name be sanctified. That's really a prayer for Mashiach. So the Yemenite nusach of the Kaddish, as long as the Rambam was alive, no longer today, b'chayechon uviyomechon, in your days and in your lifetime, uv'chayei demarana Rav Moshe ben Maimon, and may the Mashiach come in the lifetime of Rav Moshe ben Maimon. Again, that dropped out when the Rambam was nifter. But that was a tchiyat hametim. He revived the life of that community to give them the strength to go on. And eventually the Shmad did get nullified, just as the Rambam said it would get nullified. And as you know, the Yemenite community became an exemplar of great, great devotion and religiosity. Of course, quite tragically, in very modern times, with their coming to Eretz Yisrael, there was also a shmad of sorts, which is a tragedy that is still being sorted out with the Yemenite children that were taken from their families in the early years of the state. But putting that incident aside, the Teimanim from Teiman were very, 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 very devout. In fact, back in 1948, many of them, they were living kind of a primitive life. Many were learned, but they were not technologically advanced. They were very simple people in that way. So they had never heard of airplanes, never seen airplanes. But when the airplanes in 1948 came to take them to Israel, so they said, this is the fulfillment of the verse, Va'esa eschem al kanfei nisharim. I will carry you on the wings of eagles. V'yavi etchem elai, and I will bring you to me. And they said, this is God's fulfillment. Truth is, that's actually a very logical statement. Obviously, the Torah is not going to talk about, I'll send airplanes for you. That wouldn't be understood. The Torah has to use terminology that would be understood by people at the time. But in terms of what it ultimately means, indeed, that's very logical that the Kanfei Nesharim were the airplanes and the like. And the strength of the Yemenite communities over hundreds and hundreds of years came largely from the Igeret Teiman that the Rambam sent them. So the particular value of this letter for that community was quite literally incalculable. Again, it was sent in the 1100s, the 12th century, and it sustained them for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Of course, Yemenites had another controversy that's quite interesting, way after the Rambam, and that is the acceptance of the Zohar. This is actually a very, very, very interesting thing. We know generally that Sfardim as a whole, and again, Teimanim are technically not Sfardim, but we kind of lump them together. Sfardim as a whole are usually very Kabbalistically inclined. They incorporate the Zohar. I don't mean that the average Sephardi, actually knows the Zohar, probably not, but still, they're Kabbalistic in their practices, in their orientations. They will read Zohar, even if they don't understand what the Zohar says. And many Teimanim are the same, but there was a group of Teimanim who refused to accept the authority of the Zohar, and they broke away. Actually, they claimed they were the older tradition of Teiman, but they broke away from the Kabbalistic orientation of the Teimanim. And that same group, by the way, didn't even accept the Shulchan Aruch of Yosef Karo. They looked at the Rambam's Mishnah Torah as the only source of halacha that they followed. And among them was actually some famous Yemenite rabbis, including Rav Yosef Kapach, was one of the great Teimani leaders. He was a man of peace, so he didn't make machlokas, but he was of the movement that did not accept the Zohar at all. So this is a very interesting machlokas, because there are many that say he who does not accept the Zohar is an apikoris, and there are others who say they say he who accepts the Zohar is an apikoris. They consider the Zohar itself to be a heretical work, because of the doctrine of the 10 Sfiros they claim was a multiplicity in the nature of God, and they said you weren't allowed to even believe it. So it wasn't just a question, people think, was the Zohar written by Shimon Bar Yochai or Moshe de Leon? I mean, that's an authorship question. Rather, the Dardarim, the name of that Yemenite group, they took the position that the Zohar was a heretical work that you were not even allowed to study because of its multiplicity. So that's another machlokas within the Teimani community. Most do subscribe to the Zohar, but there's still a few holdouts, Rav Kapach's family and the like. Okay, so that's kind of the basic purpose of Igeret Teiman, and therefore it is a little different than Maimer Kiddush Hashem. The Maimer Kiddush Hashem was about the duty of martyrdom. This is chizuk and nechama and comfort and holding on, and to look at your persecution as a badge of pride. And the Rambam then discusses a little bit of the history of anti-Semitism up to his time. Of course, there have been quite a few additional parts of the story that came after the Rambam. But he basically says that ever since the Jewish people were given the Torah, again, he bases this on Chazal, we got the Torah at Har Sinai. Now, Chazal say, why is Har Sinai called Sinai? Because it has many names. It's also called Har Chorev. So Sinai, Chazal say, is connected to the word Sina, because sin and Samach are interchangeable letters. Not in modern Hebrew, but in Lashon HaTorah. So as a result, Har Sinai is called Sinai, that because of the Torah, Yarda Sina Liolam, the nations of the world hate us because of the Torah. That's an interesting idea. The idea is that the Torah created morality. The Torah created conscience. The Torah created accountability. The Torah taught that just because you have the power to do things doesn't mean you have the right to do things. And the nations of the world hated that idea because they didn't want any limit. Now remember, the nations of the world also worshipped gods. They were pagans. But those pagans did not impose any limitation. Right? Zeus did not care if you were moral or charitable or kind or compassionate, because that was hardly a description of Zeus himself. Right? So they had a religion. In other words, religion was like your mafia protection guy. You'd pay this powerful god to protect you. But there was no implication for how you lived your life. Torah created a moral constraint on the power of man. And therefore it was a source of hatred. Hatred against the Jews that bear that Torah. Now, fascinatingly, what the Rambam says is the source of this hatred of Jews was said by none other, I hate to quote him as a source, by Adolf Hitler, Yimach Shemo, in Mein Kampf. In a very pathological way, and please forgive me if this is hurtful or offensive, Hitler was, in fact, a very perceptive student of Judaism. He understood exactly what Judaism was, and he hated it and wanted to destroy it. But he understood. He said, Jews created the idea of conscience. Jews created the idea of moral restraint. Hitler then concluded that this has been destructive because it limits human power. It limits our ability to do what we want to do. It is therefore, this was his false conclusion, a destructive force that we must eradicate by getting rid of every last Jew. So, this is exactly what Chazal said. Sinai, sheyorda sina liolam. The Torah brought hatred of the Jew into the world. Just as we say in modern speech, those who are anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, are anti-Jewish. So, taking it a little further to this tradition, those who are anti-Semitic are anti-Torah. They're anti what the Torah represents. Now, I have to admit, there is a question that bothers me a little bit because I seem to hear two different models of why God allows anti-Semitism in the world, and they seem to be a little contradictory. On one hand, we just have the idea that I just said, that anti-Semitism is hatred of what the Torah represents. But then we have another idea, that anti-Semitism comes into the world because Jews wander away from the Torah, and they want to assimilate, and they want to become like the nations of the world, so God sends, as it were, rejection from those nations, so that we will turn to Torah. So, is anti-Semitism spiritually a hatred of Torah, or is it a punishment or a warning or a message because Jews are wandering away from the Torah? Both themes are stated in different places, including the Torah itself, but it's hard to see that they're fully consistent.
Also, there are other contradictions. There are anti-Semites who say the Jews rule the world, they have all the money, they have all the power, and on the other hand, they're rats, they're vermin, they're lowest of the low. So
yeah,
that's how the world's living.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at Christian anti-Semitism, you actually see mamash a contradiction. Mamash, a theological contradiction. On one hand, Christianity says, or said, I'm not going to deal with the present situation, said that the fact that the Jews were exiled, the fact that the Jews were hated, the fact that the Jews are persecuted, the fact that the Jews are poor and impoverished, that's a sign that God has rejected them. And that's exactly what the Yemenite Jews are feeling then, in the Rambam's case. Meaning, we're looking at the lowliness of the Jew as proof that God rejects them. That's been a standard Christian claim. And then we have the opposite. We hate the Jews because they control the banks and they control the economic system and everything that happens in the world. So on one hand, the Jews are hated because they're lowly and inferior. And then the Jews are hated because they're rich, wealthy, powerful, and control everything. They tell a joke, it's an interesting thing that Jews have had always a sense of humor to get through life, even in very difficult times. So we actually have, as strange as it is, Holocaust humor a little bit. Again, this is from the people who went through the situation. That's why I could say it's not, God forbid, somebody else making a joke of it. That this goes back to the early 30s, after 1933, but before there were concentration camps. But there were the Nuremberg laws, there was anti-Semitic decrees, Jews were losing their businesses, things were starting. That was later, but things were starting to happen, even before there was extermination. And the infamous Nazi paper was Der Stürmer, which was just filled with hatred of Jews, every line. So a Jewish guy's on a bus, and he sees his friend on the bus, and his friend is reading the Nazi paper. So he says to his friend, "What are you doing? You're reading a paper that's calling for the death of Jews and the hatred of Jews. Why are you reading the paper?" He says, we're going through very hard times now. We're losing our property, losing our money. There's persecution. There's anti-Semitism. There's riots against us in the streets. Every day is bad news. But I pick up the Nazi paper and I read, Jews control the banks, Jews have wealth. Says, I want to get a little good news once in a while, right? So I read the anti-Semitic paper because then I get good news about how powerful and rich the Jewish people are. So you're 100% right. I guess anti-Semitism doesn't need internal logic, and they can go with opposite ideas. But the Rambam goes with the idea that the hatred of the Jew is a hatred of the Torah because of the spiritual message the Torah represents. And therefore, from the beginning of time, kings and governments have tried to dissuade us. And the Rambam says there were 3 different strategies that were used, different times, different places. The first strategy was physical compulsion, meaning abandon your Torah or we will kill you, right? Physical compulsion. And that gets into martyrdom and the like. The second approach that different cultures used was attempts at logical refutation. In other words, to try to undermine belief in God intellectually by books of philosophy, by atheism, etc. Or even by history, by basically saying, hey, if God loved you, why are you being treated this way? In other words, not trying to get you away from Judaism by compulsion, but to get you away by logical arguments, to either deny a creator, deny a Torah, or to make the argument that God has rejected you because of the way you're living. Right? So that's argumentation. Now the Rambam notes, sometimes method 1 was coupled with method 2. Sometimes they existed separately. Then the Rambam mentions a third way in which Jews would be confused, and that is by the invention of alternative faith systems that seem to mimic Judaism in some way, but are ultimately based on totally different premises. And here, he uses both Christianity and Islam as 2 examples of faith systems that on some level do resemble Judaism. They have mitzvos and averos. They have reward and punishment systems. They have a lot of overlap with what's in the Torah. And as a result, many Jews could be led astray by basically saying this may be a new and improved type of Judaism. So we have these three overlapping methodologies: the physical coercion, the philosophical disputation, and the creation of alternative faith systems that might convince a person is a new and improved transformation of the Torah. In other words, the Torah itself was changed to be improved in various ways. And the Rambam uses some very striking language. First of all, I want to point out, whenever he refers to Muhammad throughout this letter, he calls him Hamashuga Hazeh. That's the only way. He calls him in the insane person. Now, again, I can't read the original Arabic, so I'm not sure if the translator did that or the Rambam did that. But he calls him Hamashuga Hazeh. He talks about Yeshu Hanotzri, Jesus of Nazareth, and the Meshuga Hazeh, different times. Both tried to create. So with Jesus, he makes an interesting point. Now, again, did the Rambam fully know the history of Christianity? I'm not sure he did. So the truth of the matter is, I don't automatically accept the Rambam's historical reconstruction of Christianity as 100% accurate. But the Rambam says the man called Yeshu Hanotzri, which is Jesus of Nazareth, of Nazareth, he says, claims to be a prophet of God. He claimed to be a Mashiach of God. The Rambam says he was executed by the sages as a false prophet. Now, you should know that itself is a really, really interesting thing. If you read the accounts in the Christian Bible of the execution of Jesus, the accounts normally say that he was executed by the Romans based on the accusations of Jewish people. And the Romans executed him not for religious reasons. The Romans executed him because if he was claiming to be a Mashiach, he might lead a revolt against Rome, and we have to get rid of him as a political matter. The Romans were always on tenterhooks. They say the scariest time, if you were a Roman, a soldier, the scariest day of the year was Erev Pesach. Because imagine, you're this Roman soldier, and you have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Jews coming to Yerushalayim to bring a Korban Pesach. And if you're a Roman soldier, you know that every single one of these millions of people hates my guts and will be happy to kill me. And then, on Erev Pesach, comes this guy riding on a donkey who is acknowledged, as the Messiah, the Mashiach, the Redeemer. Well, the Romans can't tolerate that. The Romans get rid of this guy right away. So with the Romans, it was not a big religious deal. It was simply a matter of getting rid of him as soon as they could. But the Rambam actually says that Yashka was executed by the Jews themselves as a Navi Sheker. So go figure. Christians have been accusing Jews of deicide for thousands of years. The Catholic Church finally exonerated us fairly recently. But it turns out that they were right all along. Basically, we did kill him because he was a Navi Sheker. We did kill him, and we had the right to kill him, according to them. Now, the Rambam then says, and this part is true, that Jesus did not intend to create a new religion. Jesus is not the inventor of Christianity. Jesus' claim was he was a prophet of God. His claim was he was the Messiah, he was the Mashiach of God. Now the Rambam does say that Yashka did claim that the mitzvot of the Torah were no longer binding. Now that itself may be an open question, but he did not intend to create a new religion. The actual inventor of Christianity as a separate faith system was Paul, who was also Jewish. Paul never even knew Jesus. Paul had this vision, supposedly of Yashka, on the famous road to Damascus and the like. So the Rambam says, Yeshu Hanotzri did not intend to create a new religion. That was created by his disciples later, but he did intend to be a false prophet and wean people away from the mitzvot. And Mohammed as well, the Meshuggah Mohammed, claimed to have new revelations that superseded the Torah. The Rambam says about both of these religious systems that although they bear an external resemblance to many, many facets of Judaism, they are as similar to Judaism as a monkey imitating a human being. A monkey can do many things that human beings do, and it looks the same, but of course it's fundamentally different. He uses two mishalim. One is a monkey imitating a human being, and the other is a statue resembling a human being. The statue looks just like a human being, might be theoretically, or we might say a movie image might look like a human being, but it's not the same. The panemiut, the internal aspect, is totally not the same. Now again, let me just remind you, in the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam does assign a positive role to both Christianity and Islam as a way of weaning the world away from degenerate paganism towards a greater sense of morality. So although he decries them as false beliefs, he sees them as representing a progress in the evolution of a moral consciousness towards monotheism. Now you might say, well, isn't that so different than calling it a monkey? But again, you have to understand that a lot of things depend on the audience that you're addressing. Meaning, when the Rambam is discussing something abstractly, like in the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam will concede that Christianity and Islam have had positive impact in the world on some level. But here he's talking to demoralized people who want to abandon Judaism because they see greater value in these other religions. So here the Rambam has to move in the opposite direction to kind of denigrate what these other religions are and that they should not be taken so seriously. So the fact that rhetorically the Rambam switches tones is not really that difficult, because depending on what your purpose is in your communication, that will determine your tone. Here, the Rambam is very, very denigrating of these other religions, simply because he needs to pull all stops out to prevent Jews from going over. Okay, so I just want to end with this idea that Igeret Taman is actually dealing with a triple threat. I didn't mention all of the threats. One is the threat of the forced conversions, which in turn have both an external aspect of coercion and an internal aspect of demoralization. That's threat number one, which has two components. Threat number two was a Jewish apostate to Islam. We haven't spoken about this yet. Actually circulated a book trying to prove from the Torah itself that Muhammad is God's successor to Moshe. And this is coming from a Jew, and people are reading this book and looking at the philosophical and textual arguments. So that's a second threat, which we didn't talk about today. We'll talk about next week. The third threat is kind of the opposite, and that's a whole other theme of this letter. And that is, in the middle of all of this mess comes a guy who claims to be Mashiach to redeem the Jewish people. So we get into false messianism. And the Rambam has to put out that fire, because false messianism can be absolutely catastrophic. So the triple threat, the conversion, which is both coercive and demoralizing, the philosophical anti-Jewish arguments in which the Torah itself is said to be a source for Muhammad, and then the third issue is the false Mashiach in Yemen that could wreak a lot of havoc on the Jewish people. The Rambam is concerned not only with the extra demoralization that's going to cause if it turns out that he's false, but the fact that the very safety of the community is at issue here. Because a guy shows up, Mashiach, and Jews join him and they try to rebel against the government. The government may just massacre them, and the like. So the Rambam suggests on the false Mashiach, the Rambam suggests, throw the guy in jail, publicize that he's crazy, and only when it's well known that he's crazy, then you can let him out, because then the government won't pay attention to him, and they just know he's another Meshuggah. But until it is a well-known public fact that he's a Meshuggah, just keep him behind bars, so he's not going to be a danger. But again, we'll talk about that, because the Rambam does digress into astrology, which is something else he talks about. What are the signs of Mashiach? How do you know if somebody is a true Mashiach, a false Mashiach, right? So there's a lot of interesting things that come out in this letter. So God willing, we'll hopefully finish it next week. Be well.